Hey sleepyheads, welcome in, get comfy and tell me your coordinates. Where are you listening from today and what snack have you got in hand? A crumbly biscuit? A sneaky midnight brownie? A bowl of grapes you swear you'll stop at just one more? Whatever it is, settle in because tonight's story is the very definition of quiet drama. The tale of Typhoid Mary, the woman who didn't feel sick, yet left illness in her wake. Picture New York City in the early 1900s. Clatter of streetcars, coal smoke smudging the sky, tenements stacked with families, kitchens bustling in grand houses and crowded boarding rooms alike. Germ theory is still newish to the public. Hand washing is not yet a reflex, refrigeration is patchy, and modern plumbing is uneven at best. Into this half-modern, half-medieval landscape walks Mary Mallon, an Irish immigrant cook with a practical talent for peaches, oysters, and beautiful cold desserts. Exactly the sort of dishes that require careful handling. Mary felt fine. Strong, even. She had no fever, no aches, no reason to suspect anything was wrong. And yet, behind the scenes, an invisible passenger travelled with her. Salmonella typhi, the bacterium that causes typhoid fever. The unnerving twist? Some people can carry it without ever showing symptoms. An asymptomatic carrier can move through the world like a perfectly healthy person, working, cooking, riding the streetcar, while unintentionally passing along a serious disease. When outbreaks began appearing in households where Mary worked, a relentless investigator connected the dots, and the newspapers, never known for understatement, christened her Typhoid Mary. Cue headlines, panic, and a public health dilemma still debated today. How do you protect the many without trampling the rights of the one? This episode isn't a jump scare, it's a slow burn. We'll walk through crowded kitchens and chilly pantries, follow a health inspector's notebook from house to house, and stand on the windswept edge of North Brother Island, where Mary would spend years in quarantine. We'll talk about the ethics and the empathy. Was Mary a villain, a victim, or something messier in between? We'll peek at the science, lightly I promise, how typhoid spreads, why some carriers never get sick, and what hand washing and sanitation changed forever. And we'll look at the press coverage that turned a private woman into a public symbol for better and for worse. If you like your history like your evening tea, warm, a little nerdy, quietly absorbing, this is your cozy corner. We're not here for car chases, we're here for questions that nibble at you after the episode ends. So before we begin, send me a note. Where are you listening from? And what snack is keeping you company? And if boring but cozy history is exactly your vibe, my people, tap subscribe so your feed keeps delivering small, thoughtful stories just like this one. Ready? Put your blanket a little higher. Let's step into the kitchens of old New York and meet the most famous cook you were never sure you wanted to hire, Typhoid Mary. Mary Mallon's story starts far from New York's brownstones and summer kitchens. Born in 1869 in County Tyrone, Ireland, she grew up in a world still feeling the aftershocks of the famine. Land was scarce, work was scarcer, and young people, especially young women, looked west. By her mid-teens, Mary joined a steady stream of Irish emigrants who crossed the Atlantic with a simple plan: find work fast, send money home, and carve out a measure of independence. If you picture Ellis Island when you think immigration line, hit pause. Mary likely arrived before Ellis Island opened, 1892, so her first American checkpoint was Castle Garden at the tip of Manhattan. The system was brisk: a health glance, a few questions about relatives or a promised job, and then out into a new city that smelled like coal, horses and opportunity. Most Irish girls travelled steerage, not pleasant but cheap, and landed with a trunk, a parish contact, and the name of an intelligence office, an early employment agency, scribbled on a scrap of paper. New York in the Gilded Age offered two very distinct tracks for a working-class woman. You could take your chances in factories, needle trades, box-making, canneries, with irregular pay and crowded boarding houses. Or you could enter domestic service as a live-in maid, laundress or cook. The second path had a reputation among Irish immigrants as the safer route, room and board included, cash wages, and a social world anchored by parish, neighbourhood, and other Irish servants who shared tips and openings. It also came with trade-offs: long hours, few days off, and employers who expected loyalty, discretion, and spotless silver. Mary stepped into that second world and moved up quickly. Kitchens were meritocracies. If you could make reliable bread, coax flavour from cheap cuts, and plate a decent pudding, you were valuable. If you could manage a full dinner for 12 without panic, you were gold. Irish women dominated New York's servant market in these years, and cooking, though hard, paid better than general housework. A competent cook could earn significantly more per month than a chambermaid, and the role carried status within a household staff. Cooks ordered provisions, guarded the pantry, and negotiated with butchers. They kept a mental map of what each employer liked and what each guest could not eat. For an ambitious young immigrant, cook was the job to get. Agencies matched workers to homes in a city where wealth piled up fast. Families on Fifth Avenue wanted dinners that impressed. Families in the outer wards wanted hearty, reliable meals. Many households left town for the summer, Oyster Bay, the Jersey Shore, the Hudson Valley, and took their staff with them. That mattered for Mary's future. The summer house circuit would later place her in kitchens tied to several typhoid outbreaks. But at the outset, it was simply normal work life. Same employer, new kitchen, new water supply, same job. The pressures of domestic service were real. Live-in staff often rose before the family and collapsed after the last dish was dried. Days off might mean one afternoon a week or less. Privacy was limited, and cooks were judged by results more than personality. Yet there were perks. Steady money meals, a warm place to sleep, and an upward ladder from kitchen maid to assistant to full cook. For immigrants who did not want to marry immediately, the job also offered autonomy. You could keep your savings, pick your placements, and walk if a household became unbearable. There were always other ads. Mary was good at this. Accounts agree she knew her craft, and she preferred kitchens where she could be in charge. Cold desserts and composed dishes were favourites of the era. Think moulded gelatins, fruit ices, and dainty salads. Precisely the kinds of foods a well-heeled family might request for summer lunches. Those dishes also involved a lot of handling and little cooking time, a detail that will matter later when we talk about typhoid and food safety. For now, it's just part of the job description. Keep the icebox stocked, turn out something elegant, and don't let the mayonnaise split. The city around her was a study in extremes. Mansions rose along new avenues while tenements crowded the Lower East Side. New bridges and elevated railways stitched boroughs together. Sanitation was improving, but unevenly. Some households drank filtered water, others relied on wells or intermittent municipal supply. Kitchens used ice cut from rivers in winter or delivered from ice plants. Milk could be pure or not. Oysters were a treat and also a gamble. Cooks navigated this patchwork every day without a safety net of modern food codes. It's easy to jump ahead and stamp Mary with her future nickname, but the early chapter is simpler. A capable Irish cook making her way in a booming city. She earned respect inside the back-of-house world and kept getting hired, which is the most practical measure of success there is. Employers trusted her to order food, direct helpers, and deliver on time. Agencies sent her to homes that expected results. At street level, her life would have looked like routine. Mass in the parish where Irish accents filled the pews, a letter posted home with a few dollars enclosed, errands to the butcher, baker or grocer, and occasional afternoons off spent with other domestics sharing news about a good place or a family to avoid. It wasn't glamorous, but it was stable. And for an immigrant woman in the 1890s, stability was a win. The irony, known to us but not to her, was that Mary carried Salmonella typhi without symptoms. In the early years, there was no reason for her to think beyond the next meal service. Germ theory had not yet reached the kitchen in the way we understand it today. Hand washing mattered, but not everyone believed it. Clean water mattered, but access was patchy. A strong cook who never took sick was an asset, not a warning sign. So Mary Mallon's New York debut looks like thousands of others. A teenager from Ireland navigating agencies, kitchens and employers in a city built on immigrant labour. She chose a trade that rewarded skill, kept her housed and fed, and let her save. The heavy ethical questions and public health battles are still ahead. In this beginning, the story is about opportunity, hustle, and the practical ladder of domestic work in a Gilded Age city that ran on the quiet competence of women like Mary. For an Irish immigrant woman in Gilded Age New York, the household kitchen wasn't a backwater, it was the top of the domestic ladder. Among live-in staff, the cook stood closest to the family's daily comfort and public reputation. A good dinner could smooth social calls and impress guests. A bad one could travel quickly through a neighbourhood that measured status by what appeared on the table. That pressure translated into pay and authority. Cooks generally earned more than chambermaids or parlourmaids, and the role came with discretion over menus, purchasing, and the small budget lines that kept a household running. For someone like Mary Mallon, competent, steady, and uninterested in factory floors, the kitchen offered skill, leverage, and a reliable wage under one roof. Domestic service in New York was a large, fluid market. Intelligence offices, employment agencies matched servants and households. Parishes and ethnic newspapers passed along leads. Turnover was routine. Families moved seasonally and servants changed places when conditions or pay didn't suit. In that environment, reputation was currency. Workers carried written references, characters, from previous employers, and a strong one opened doors to better addresses and higher rates. Cooking experience counted twice. First, because it signalled competence, and second, because it reduced the training burden for the next employer. A cook who could step into an unfamiliar kitchen, survey the range and pantry, and serve a respectable dinner within a day or two was valuable. Kitchens in the 1890s, 1900s were also changing. Coal and gas ranges replaced open hearths in many homes. Iceboxes extended what could be stored. Urban butchers and grocers delivered. Cookbooks such as Fanny Farmer's 1896 popularised standardised measurements, while the domestic science movement tried to rationalise household labour. In elite homes, French-influenced dishes and neat presentation were in fashion. In middle-class ones, economy and consistency mattered most. Across that spectrum, a capable cook managed three linked tasks: provisioning, choosing vendors, checking quality, balancing the week's spend; production, turning out breakfasts, luncheons and multi-course dinners on schedule; and supervision, directing a kitchen maid or scullery maid, keeping order and maintaining the range. The job was physical and clock-driven, but it rewarded planning and calm. Mary fit the market well. Accounts of her work life, scattered across later investigations and employer recollections, suggest someone who preferred control of the kitchen and delivered what households expected: reliable roasts, breads that rose, and fashionable cold dishes for summer tables. Those cold preparations, custards, ice creams, moulded gelatins, salads, were a mark of modernity and a regular feature of the summer circuit when families decamped to Long Island, the Hudson Valley, or New Jersey. Cooks who travelled with employers gained continuity: same family, steady pay, and new working environments, different water sources, different kitchens, all of which added to their experience and their bargaining power when they returned to the city in the fall. Why was cooking coveted among Irish domestic workers in particular? Wages were one part, control was another. Unlike general housework, cooking allowed a worker to set the day's cadence, place orders with favoured suppliers, and decide when a dish was good enough to send upstairs. It also offered small but meaningful perquisites: tips after a successful dinner, holiday gifts, and sometimes discretion over leftovers that could supplement a servant's own meals. For women postponing marriage or sending money home, those extras and a dependable monthly wage made saving possible. And because cooks were measured by results more than polish, the job rewarded practice and nerve rather than perfect English or finishing school manners. Hiring reflected that logic. Families asked agencies for a good plain cook, or a cook who can do desserts, and trial dinners were common. Success was public within the small world of employers. A host might praise a dinner to a neighbour, who then asked the agency for the same kind of cook. Failure travelled too. Cooks therefore tended to specialise in what they could execute with confidence and repeat under pressure. Mary's repeat placements in households of means point to a record of meeting those expectations. She moved from one good place to another, and each successful season made her easier to place at similar addresses. The kitchen status also reflected broader urban patterns. New York's wealthy dined out, but they entertained at home to cement connections. A private cook extended a family's social reach. Professional restaurants could not always substitute for a table in one's own dining room. That dynamic kept demand high for cooks who could stage a luncheon on short notice or cater a weekend's worth of guests at a summer house. Even in less grand homes, reliable everyday meals were prized by breadwinners who worked long hours and expected stability at the end of the day. In both settings, a cook's absence created immediate disruption, which gave experienced women negotiating room over time off, wages or duties. None of this removed the strains. Hours were long, privacy was limited, and the margin for error at a formal dinner was slim. Cooks woke before the household to light the range, planned menus around delivery schedules, and worked through heat and holidays. But compared with the hazards of factory work, variable pay, piece rates, layoffs, and crowded lodging, the kitchen offered a clearer trade, hard days for steady returns. For Mary, who never took sick in the eyes of employers and colleagues, the bargain looked sound. In hindsight, the details that later mattered for public health were already present. Cold dishes with much handling, kitchens that moved between city and shore, and water sources of variable safety, these formed the stage on which Mary's career advanced. But at the time, they were evidence of her competence, not a warning. She got hired because she could take charge of a kitchen and deliver on a household's expectations. That is how she became sought after, by stacking successful placements, earning strong references and mastering the rhythms of a city that ran on dinners served on time. Only later would investigators read those same movements as a pattern with a different meaning. Mary's dinners went from brownstones to summer houses, but her kitchens were all plugged into the same city ecosystem. To understand how a cook who never took sick could leave illness in her wake, you have to zoom out from the stove to the streets, pipes, pumps, and people that made New York hum around 1900. It was a marvel and a mess. Start with the buildings. By the 1890s, New York was a tenement city. Block after block of 5- and 6-story walk-ups squeezed families into narrow flats, 2 or 3 rooms deep with a window only at the front and back. The famous dumbbell design, mandated after 1879, added air shafts, but those quickly became vertical garbage cans. One toilet might serve 15 to 20 people on a floor. In older buildings, privies still sat in small yards. Overcrowding wasn't just uncomfortable, it was logistical. If your hallway sink was shared by 4 households, hand washing was a negotiation. If your toilet backed up, everyone knew. Diseases that travel by what public health politely calls the fecal-oral route, typhoid specialty, had plenty of help. Now the water. New York proudly piped Croton water from upstate starting in the 1840s, and by Mary's era, much of Manhattan had taps. That sounded modern, and compared with the bad old days of local wells, it was. But has a tap didn't mean always safe. Pipes leaked, cross-connections let wastewater sneak into lines, rooftop storage tanks went uncleaned, basement cisterns hosted their own biology experiments. In certain boroughs and suburbs, families still relied on wells, some dangerously close to privies. When outbreaks flared, investigators often found a familiar pattern: a cracked pipe, a contaminated tank, a well used after heavy rains. In short, Croton was a good system stretched by a fast-growing city. Milk and ice added plot twists. New Yorkers loved milk, and so did bacteria. Before pasteurization was common, milk came from country farms and urban swill dairies, travelled by rail and wagon, and was watered and sweetened on the way when sellers were unscrupulous. If the watering can was filled from a tainted pump or a tub where bottles were rinsed in the same water all day, you had a ready vehicle for disease. The same went for ice. Families chilled food with river ice or factory ice. Oyster cellars and pushcarts kept their wares cool with whatever they could get. If the ice source or the meltwater was contaminated, your fancy moulded custard or shaved ice treat picked up a little something extra. Sewers were racing to keep up. New York laid miles of pipe in the late 19th century, but the city still discharged much of its waste directly into rivers and the harbour. Tide and current did some of the cleaning. Oysters did more and became their own hazard when harvested from dirty beds. In summer, heat accelerated everything. Milk soured faster, food spoiled, and microbes multiplied. Houseflies shuttled between privies and kitchens like tiny delivery boys. Street cleaning improved under reforming administrations, but a city of horses produced constant manure, and ash barrels were as likely to hold food scraps as cinders. The sanitation department and the health department could write rules faster than landlords and vendors could change habits. Add people in motion. Immigrants arrived daily, workers commuted by elevated railways and ferries, families with means rotated between town and country with the seasons. Disease didn't care if you lived on Fifth Avenue or Avenue B. A cook, laundress, or milkman connected households across class lines. A cold summer dessert prepared in a spotless uptown kitchen could still start with milk carried through hot streets, cooled with questionable ice, and mixed by hands washed at a crowded hallway sink in a boarding house. That chain is what public health then and now calls disease ecology, how environments, infrastructure, and human behaviour create routes for pathogens. The city wasn't clueless. After the Civil War, New York created one of the country's first modern health departments. Inspectors tracked smallpox, cholera, and typhoid. They issued placards, closed wells, and sued scofflaw landlords. Tenement laws in 1895 and 1901 set standards for light, air, and sanitation. Milk commissions promoted pasteurization. Newspapers ran crusades. Reformers toured slums with notebooks. Engineers drew bigger pipes. But enforcement was uneven, and science was mid-transition. Germ theory had won in the lab, yet many kitchen practices and vendor routines still belonged to an earlier world. This is where Mary's story fits. Her employers were households that ate well, kept staff, and expected up-to-date convenience, running water, ice boxes, fashionable cold dishes. Those very conveniences intersected with the city's weak points: perishable foods, lots of handling, and water or iceborne contamination risks. When illness followed a move to a summer rental with a private well, or a city home with a neglected rooftop tank, investigators later saw a pattern that no one at the time could easily recognise, especially if the cook never seemed ill herself. One more ingredient: speed. New York was adding people and buildings faster than it could retrofit plumbing, pave streets, or teach every vendor new habits. A single season could bring a new tenement on a block, a fresh break in an old main, a wave of lodgers into an apartment, and a different milk dealer on your corner. In that churn, outbreaks were not mysteries so much as the predictable side effects of growth under partial modernisation. Public health fought fires and tried to install fireproofing at the same time. So when a competent, in-demand cook like Mary Mallon stepped into a kitchen, she brought her skills and stepped onto this complicated stage. The tenements, the waterworks, the milk pails, the ice blocks, the sewers, the summer migrations, together they created a city where the dinner that made your guests happy could also, invisibly, make them sick. That's the backdrop to the investigations that would soon turn Mary from a sought-after chef into a household name. Step out of Mary's kitchen and into the microbiology. The guest, no one invited, was Salmonella enterica serotype typhi, shorthand S. typhi. It's a strictly human pathogen. No pigs, pigeons or pets carry it in nature. That matters because once S. typhi found a human host in a city like New York, the only place it could go next was another human, through the routes people created with food, water and hands. What does typhoid do? After exposure, there's an incubation, often 1 to 3 weeks, when the newly infected person feels fine. Then comes a stepwise fever that climbs day by day, with headache, exhaustion, stomach discomfort, and often constipation at first. Diarrhea tends to show up later. Doctors in Mary's time looked for a relative slow pulse for the degree of fever, a coated tongue, and sometimes faint rose spots on the trunk. In bad cases, the intestinal lining can ulcerate. Complications include bleeding or perforation. Before antibiotics, case fatality rates could reach around 1 in 10. Recovery when it came was slow and relapses were not rare. How does S. typhi get from one person to another? The unglamorous short answer is the fecal-oral route. If tiny amounts of stool from an infected person, someone acutely ill or an asymptomatic carrier, contaminate food or drink that isn't cooked again, the bacteria get a free ride into the next diner's gut. In a tenement block, that could happen via a shared sink, a leaky pipe, a rooftop tank that hadn't been cleaned, or a well sunk too close to a privy. In a household kitchen, it could happen at the prep table if the cook's hands weren't properly washed, especially when preparing cold dishes. Carriers are the plot twist. A minority of infected people don't clear S. typhi completely. The bacteria can set up a long-term home in the gallbladder, especially if gallstones are present, and shed intermittently in stool for months or years. Carriers feel fine. They go to work. They prepare meals. To co-workers and employers, they're never sick. To epidemiologists, they're the invisible link in a chain of outbreaks that otherwise looks like bad luck. That's the position Mary Mallon would occupy in public health reports a few years after the era we've been describing. Why were water and food such efficient vectors in turn-of-the-century New York? Start with water. Even with the Croton Aqueduct, delivery was only as safe as the last pipe, tank or tap. Cross connections, negative pressure from firefighting or a cracked main could pull contaminated water into a line. Rooftop tanks and basement cisterns collected sediment and biofilm. If a building's tank wasn't cleaned, everyone upstairs got whatever was brewing. The city was modernising, but growth outran maintenance. Milk magnified the problem. Before routine pasteurisation, milk travelled long distances and warmed up in transit. It was a ready medium for bacteria, and vendors sometimes diluted it with the nearest water to stretch supply. If that water was contaminated, or if bottles sat in rinse tubs all day, typhi could hitch along and multiply. Families served milk to children and used it in custards, puddings and ice creams, foods that weren't boiled just before serving, so any contamination had a straight shot to the table. Cold dishes were another weak point. Cooking kills typhi. Cooling and handling can put it back. Salads. Sliced fruit, oysters, ice cream and moulded gelatin desserts were fashionable precisely because they were cool and uncooked at serving time. If the cook's hand-washing happened at a crowded hallway sink with lukewarm water and one shared towel, or if ingredients were chilled with ice from a questionable source, a modern menu could quietly carry an old problem. Kitchen routines mattered as much as infrastructure. In elite homes, a skilled cook like Mary prepared large batches, plated for many guests, and worked under time pressure. That increases the opportunities for cross-contamination. One quick taste with a spoon that returns to the bowl, one rinse in a basin used for other tasks, one interruption between cracking eggs and forming custard. In boarding houses and summer rentals, conditions were less controlled. Private wells of uncertain safety, borrowed utensils, and ice boxes packed with the week's supplies. None of this required negligence. It only required ordinary habits in a city still catching up to germ theory. Public health tools of the era were improving, but imperfect. Inspectors could culture bacteria from water or stool, but testing everyone everywhere wasn't realistic. The Weedle test, an early blood test, existed, but it wasn't definitive on its own. Vaccines would be used mainly in military settings before they reached civilians in a big way. Chlorination of municipal water, which would drive typhoid down dramatically, was just beginning to be adopted in American cities. So day-to-day prevention still hinged on behaviour: safe water sources, clean tanks, careful milk handling and scrupulous kitchen hygiene, hand-washing with soap, separation of raw and ready-to-eat foods, and no post-cooking contamination. Put it together, and the invisible passenger isn't mysterious at all. typhi rode the same network that made New York powerful: dense housing, shared utilities, mobile labour and elaborate foodways. A healthy-looking cook could seed a salad, a cracked pipe could seed a tenement, a milk pail could seed a neighbourhood. That's why health officials eventually followed the outbreaks not just to a block or a pump, but to specific kitchens and specific workers. And that's how Mary Mallon's otherwise unremarkable career became a public health detective story. A human reservoir moving through households connected by water, milk, ice, and menus that didn't put every dish back on the fire before it reached the table. By the early 20th century, scientists and health officials had a startling realization: some people could spread deadly disease without ever looking or feeling ill. This concept, an asymptomatic carrier, was baffling to the public and frustrating for doctors who were used to associating illness with visible symptoms. In the case of typhoid fever, it changed everything. Suddenly, a cook, laundress or milkman might unknowingly be the source of repeated outbreaks, despite appearing perfectly healthy. That idea was unsettling in a city like New York, already bursting with immigrants, crowded tenements and fragile public health systems. The mechanics of this strange phenomenon rested in microbiology. Salmonella typhi, the bacterium responsible for typhoid fever, could take up long-term residence in a person's gallbladder or intestinal tract. While most victims became violently ill with high fevers, delirium, and often death, a smaller portion never developed symptoms. Their immune systems kept the bacteria at bay enough to prevent sickness, but not enough to eradicate it. That meant the germs remained alive, multiplying silently and exiting the body in feces or urine. From there, the bacteria travelled into water supplies, milk jugs, or food handled by the unsuspecting host. It was an invisible chain reaction. A cook might prepare a salad without thoroughly washing her hands, and the lettuce, innocent-looking and crisp, became a vehicle of disease. Families who dined at the table would fall sick days later, never guessing the cheerful kitchen worker was the link. Because the carrier never coughed, sneezed, or collapsed, suspicion rarely landed on them. Instead, people blamed bad water, spoiled milk, or even the wrath of the summer heat. This made the job of health inspectors nearly impossible. When typhoid erupted in middle or upper-class households, families who prided themselves on good sanitation, the mystery deepened. They had clean wells, indoor plumbing, even deliveries from reputable dairies. Yet outbreaks kept occurring. Investigators had to play detective, following the trail of servants and cooks who drifted from one household to the next. Each time an outbreak flared, the same name would reappear in the background. That's what made Mary Mallon, later infamously known as Typhoid Mary, so notorious. She was one of the first identified carriers in the United States. To her, the accusation seemed absurd. She had never been sick a day in her life. How could she be blamed for the fevers and deaths of others? The science of bacteria was still relatively new, and the concept of a healthy-looking person spreading disease seemed unbelievable to many ordinary people. But public health records made the connection undeniable. Wherever Mary cooked, typhoid followed. The discovery of asymptomatic carriers sparked fierce debates. On one hand, it explained outbreaks that had mystified doctors. On the other, it raised ethical dilemmas. Could you restrict the freedom of someone who wasn't sick themselves, but posed a threat to others? In Mary's case, the answer was yes. She was forcibly quarantined for years on North Brother Island, a decision that still stirs controversy. What's most striking is how this new understanding reshaped public health. It meant that tracking only the visibly sick wasn't enough. Germs could lurk in ordinary-looking people, making hygiene and sanitation even more critical. Washing hands, cooking food thoroughly, and improving water systems suddenly had new urgency. Carriers like Mary demonstrated that epidemics weren't just about the ill, they were about the invisible. By the time health officials pieced this puzzle together, the idea of asymptomatic carriers had moved from theory to hard reality. It changed how doctors thought about infection, how governments approached outbreaks, and how ordinary people viewed their neighbours. The unsettling truth was clear. Sometimes danger wore the face of health, and that knowledge marked a turning point in the battle against disease. What made Mary Mallon such a lightning rod in the story of typhoid fever wasn't just that she was an asymptomatic carrier, it was that she was a particularly effective one. Plenty of carriers existed, and public health officials eventually identified dozens across New York. But few left behind the same trail of outbreaks, lawsuits, and headlines. To understand why Mary was different, you have to look at the mix of biology, personality, and sheer bad luck that amplified her role. First, the biology. Not all carriers shed bacteria at the same rate. Some released only small amounts, making them less likely to infect others. Mary, however, appears to have shed huge numbers of Salmonella typhi. Her gallbladder, later suspected to be heavily infected, may have been a perfect reservoir. In fact, doctors who studied her case suggested she was constantly excreting bacteria in her stool, even while she looked perfectly healthy. Combine that with her chosen profession, cooking, and you have recipe for disaster. Food prepared without thorough washing or heating provided the bacteria a direct route to diners' mouths. Unlike a milkman, whose contaminated product might be boiled before drinking, Mary's specialty was cold dishes like salads, ice cream, and peaches with custard. Perfect for hot New York summers, but also perfect vehicles for germs that cooking heat would otherwise have killed. That detail mattered enormously. Imagine the difference between a cook who prepared hearty stews, bubbling for hours on the stove, and Mary, who served chilled treats to wealthy households. In one outbreak, her now infamous peach ice cream dessert was believed to be the culprit. It was elegant, refreshing, and loaded with bacteria. The very skill that made her a sought-after chef among upper-class families also made her outbreaks deadlier. Personality played a role too. Mary was fiercely independent and stubborn, qualities that likely helped her as an immigrant Irish woman navigating New York's job market. But those same traits collided with public health officials' attempts to control her. When doctors suggested she might be carrying typhoid germs, she flatly denied it. From her perspective, it sounded absurd. She was strong, never bedridden, never weak. To her, the idea that invisible microbes were leaping from her hands into other people's stomachs was insulting, even ridiculous. Instead of cooperating, she pushed back, sometimes literally, once allegedly chasing an investigator out of a kitchen with a carving fork. Her resistance made her stand out in the records. Other carriers, when identified, often agreed to give up cooking, accept surgery to remove their gallbladders, or at least try to comply with hygiene guidelines. Mary refused all of it. She saw herself as persecuted and unfairly targeted, and in many ways she was right. She was singled out with a level of publicity and punishment that others avoided. Yet her refusal to stop cooking meant the outbreaks continued, which only strengthened officials' case against her. Then there was timing and luck, or in Mary's case, bad luck. Public health in the early 1900s was still developing. The germ theory of disease had only recently gained acceptance, and epidemiology was in its infancy. Mary became one of the first high-profile case studies in the world of asymptomatic carriers. If she had been born a decade earlier, she might have spread typhoid without anyone ever realizing it was her. A decade later, she might have been handled more quietly, spared the tabloid nickname Typhoid Mary. But she lived at the exact moment when science was ready to discover her, and newspapers were ready to sensationalize the story. Add those pieces together: her unusually high bacterial shedding, her career preparing uncooked foods, her refusal to accept medical advice, and the bad timing of becoming a case study, and you get the perfect storm. Other carriers existed, but Mary became the face of the problem. Her name turned into shorthand for invisible danger, her story into a cautionary tale about what happens when germs collide with human denial. In the end, Mary Mallon wasn't just unlucky. She was biologically primed to be one of history's most efficient disease spreaders. Her case forced doctors, lawmakers, and the public to grapple with uncomfortable questions about individual freedom versus community safety. And though she never saw herself as different from anyone else, her biology and circumstances ensured she would be remembered as unique. By the summer of 1906, Mary Mallon had already left her mark on several New York households. But the outbreak that truly set her on the path to infamy began in a genteel vacation home on Long Island. Oyster Bay, with its breezy shoreline and reputation as a getaway for the wealthy, hardly seemed like the setting for a deadly fever. The house in question belonged to the Warren family, well-off New Yorkers who had rented the property for the season. They expected seaside leisure, not a brush with epidemic disease. Yet, within weeks of their arrival, members of the household began to fall mysteriously ill. The outbreak confounded the landlord, a man named George Thompson. For him, this was more than a health scare. It was a financial disaster. Thompson prided himself on renting to affluent families who wanted a clean, safe retreat from the city. Suddenly, his prestigious summer home was being whispered about as a typhoid house. If word spread that the property harboured disease, his lucrative rental business would collapse. For the Warrens, the matter was personal and terrifying. They had every reason to believe their home was sanitary. The plumbing was modern, the water supply tested, the cesspools in order. They had hired help to prepare meals and keep the household running smoothly. Yet 7 of the 11 people in residence came down with typhoid fever. At the time, typhoid was still strongly associated with poverty, overcrowded tenements, and filthy water systems. Seeing it strike an elite family in their summer retreat was puzzling and alarming. Thompson, desperate to protect his property's reputation, called in an investigator. That man was George Soper, a sanitary engineer with a knack for solving medical mysteries. Soper was thorough, logical, and more than a little determined. When he walked into the Oyster Bay house, he didn't see a random outbreak. He saw a puzzle waiting to be solved. Soper examined the water and sewage systems, tested the pipes, and studied the wells. Everything came back clean. He traced the family's food supply from the milk deliveries to the local oysters that gave the town its name. Nothing explained the sudden rash of fevers. But as he sifted through the household records, one name stood out: Mary Mallon, the cook. She had been hired just before the Warrens fell ill and had already moved on by the time Soper arrived. Her disappearance only added to his suspicion. The real breakthrough came when Soper pieced together Mary's work history. He discovered a striking pattern. Every family that had employed her in the previous decade had suffered an outbreak of typhoid. Well-to-do households across Manhattan and Long Island had been hit after she cooked for them, often with multiple cases and occasional deaths. In Oyster Bay, the timing was too neat to ignore. Mary had cooked for the family, then gone on her way, leaving illness in her wake. To Soper, the evidence was damning, even if the idea of a healthy carrier was still new and hard for others to grasp. What made the Oyster Bay outbreak so pivotal was its social context. Here was typhoid striking a wealthy family in a pristine setting, carried there not by dirty water or city slums, but by the hands of their seemingly competent cook. It challenged the prevailing assumptions about disease and forced investigators to consider that health could be deceptive. The Warrens' fevered summer became a turning point, not just in Mary Mallon's story, but in public health history. For Thompson, the landlord, the mystery was solved, though it hardly saved his reputation. For Soper, it was the start of a relentless pursuit to track down Mary and prove his theory about carriers. And for Mary herself, though she didn't yet know it, the Oyster Bay episode marked the moment when her life would no longer be her own. She had crossed the invisible line between ordinary worker and public health menace, and the chase was only beginning. The Oyster Bay outbreak was only the beginning. For George Soper, it wasn't enough to explain one unlucky episode in a seaside home. The real question was whether Mary Mallon's employment record revealed a broader pattern. Once he began digging, the evidence practically jumped off the page. Again and again, households hired Mary to cook, and within weeks, sometimes days, people fell ill with typhoid. Then Mary would move on and the sickness would fade. It was as if the disease itself followed her suitcase, lingering only as long as she stayed. Soper's investigation read like a detective novel. He retraced her steps through employment agencies and family testimonies. One wealthy family on Park Avenue recalled how Mary had been hired in 1901 to prepare meals. Not long after, the mother of the household was struck with fever, and 2 servants also fell ill. By the time they connected the dots, Mary had already left. Another family in Long Island had hired her in 1904. Within weeks, typhoid swept through the home, sickening several children. When the family recovered, Mary was gone, off to her next job. It was uncanny the way illness seemed to flare up just after her arrival and resolve once she departed. To Soper, this was not coincidence. It was a smoking gun. In one case, a lawyer's family in Manhattan insisted their home had been spotless, their water tested, their milk boiled. Yet after Mary cooked for them, 6 out of 9 people were bedridden. Once she moved on, the house returned to health. The explanation couldn't be plumbing or contaminated deliveries. It had to be her. But convincing others was not easy. The idea that a perfectly healthy woman could be the source of such suffering was hard to swallow. Employers and doctors wanted something more concrete than timing and suspicion. Still, the sheer number of outbreaks tied to Mary was staggering. By Soper's count, at least 7 households had been struck, with more than 20 cases of typhoid and at least a few deaths, all clustered around her employment history. What made the pattern so striking was the social profile of her employers. These were not tenement families or slum dwellers where typhoid was expected. These were lawyers, bankers, and society families who prided themselves on clean homes and modern sanitation. Typhoid, in their world, was supposed to be a disease of the poor. The fact that it arrived in their parlours and sick rooms, carried by their own hired cook, made the story irresistible to the press and terrifying to the public. Soper, methodical as ever, began sketching out timelines. In his notes, Mary's name appeared like a refrain. Cook hired, illness begins. Cook departs, illness ends. He presented his findings to health officials, framing it as a clear chain of cause and effect. While skeptics demanded laboratory proof, Soper's circumstantial case was strong enough to spark serious concern. Typhoid was not just creeping through the city's water mains, it was walking in through the back door with the servants. Mary, meanwhile, remained unaware of the growing dossier against her. To her, the families she left behind were simply part of the churn of domestic service in New York. Cooks moved frequently, households shifted staff, and sickness was sadly common in an age when medicine offered little protection. She could not see the invisible lines Soper was drawing, the web of fevers and recoveries stretching behind her like footprints in the sand. What Soper saw as a clear pattern, Mary saw as bad luck, other people's misfortune that had nothing to do with her. But the record told another story. She had become the common denominator in a series of well-documented outbreaks. To health officials, the pattern was damning. To the public, it was sensational. And to Mary, it was the beginning of a battle she could never win. By the time George Soper pieced together the Oyster Bay outbreak and retraced Mary Mallon's employment trail, he had crossed an important threshold. What began as a nagging suspicion, an unlucky cook at the wrong place and time, was fast becoming something more scientific. The coincidences piled up too neatly: new job, new outbreak, sudden illness in families who should have been safe. Then, just as quickly, Mary would pack her bags, move on to another household, and the fevers would subside. To a casual observer, it might have looked like bad fortune. To Soper, trained in the emerging field of epidemiology, it was a pattern demanding explanation. This was the moment when a hunch transformed into a hypothesis. Disease detectives of Soper's day didn't have the benefit of modern DNA fingerprinting or quick lab tests. They relied on shoe leather, interviews, and the slow accumulation of circumstantial evidence. What he saw convinced him that Mary wasn't simply unlucky. She was the carrier, the invisible link tying outbreaks together. It was a bold leap, but one supported by the data he gathered. Soper's method was both straightforward and ingenious. He began with employment records, using the web of domestic service agencies that matched cooks with families across New York City and its wealthy summer colonies. Each household that hired Mary became a new data point on his map. He interviewed employers, servants, and even neighbours, compiling lists of who had fallen ill, when the sickness struck, and how long it lasted. The results were startling. In at least 7 different households between 1900 and 1907, typhoid appeared shortly after Mary's arrival. In several cases, half or more of the family and staff were infected. In one, a young girl died. Each time when Mary left, the sickness tapered off. The pattern was too consistent to ignore. Soper even noted that Mary seemed to favour positions with upper-class families, whose kitchens gave her the freedom to prepare her specialties. Cold dishes that never saw enough heat to kill bacteria. Ice cream, custards, salads. Perfect summer delicacies, but also perfect vehicles for Salmonella typhi. The timeline Soper sketched looked like a dotted trail of fever stretching across the map of New York. Park Avenue brownstones, Long Island retreats, Manhattan townhouses, all linked not by plumbing or milk deliveries, but by one woman with a cook's apron and a reputation for tasty desserts. Soper realised he wasn't just chasing a theory, he was documenting the first clear case of an asymptomatic carrier in the United States. But translating this neat diagram of cause and effect into action was another matter. Convincing city health officials required more than anecdotes. It required evidence that could stand against scepticism and, just as importantly, against Mary's inevitable denial. After all, how do you tell a perfectly healthy woman she is the walking embodiment of disease? For now, though, Soper had the building blocks of his case. He had turned whispers of coincidence into a working hypothesis. The cook who never got sick was leaving illness behind her, and the clusters of typhoid across New York pointed directly to her kitchen. To prove it, Soper would need to confront Mary herself. A task that promised to be every bit as dramatic as the mystery that led him there. George Soper finally decided that diagrams and timelines weren't enough. If Mary Mallon was the living thread tying together a string of typhoid outbreaks, he needed proof, actual laboratory samples to show that Salmonella typhi was passing through her body even while she looked perfectly well. So he did what any determined turn-of-the-century sleuth would do. He went to find her at work. He tracked her to a Manhattan townhouse kitchen, the sort of polished back-of-house domain where status was measured in polished copper pans and the speed of a competent cook. Soper introduced himself with a professional calm that did nothing to soften the message. He explained his theory, germs, carriers, outbreaks, and then asked for what he called specimens, stool, urine, and blood taken repeatedly over time. To a public health investigator, that sounded perfectly reasonable. To Mary, it sounded like an insult and a violation. Mary was not a woman who wilted under accusation. She'd worked her way through New York's service economy by being fast, exacting, and proud of her craft. Now a stranger was telling her that her hands, the same hands that made flawless custards and cleanly peeled peaches, were spreading disease. Soper recalled that she responded violently. In practical terms, that meant the conversation jumped from polite to hostile in seconds. Mary's answer was a flat no. She would not submit samples. She would not admit to anything. She wanted this man out of her kitchen. Soper tried persuasion. He cited his evidence, the Oyster Bay house, the Park Avenue addresses, the dates that lined up a little too well. He promised discretion. He even tried to frame the samples as a favour to science. But Mary heard only accusation and humiliation. According to later accounts, she grabbed a carving fork or similar kitchen implement and advanced. The sleuth retreated, dignity intact, coat perhaps less so. Whatever the exact choreography, the effect was the same. The investigator beat a hasty exit through a kitchen otherwise designed for brisk, tidy movement, not epidemiological debates. Refusal did not end the chase. It widened it. Soper redoubled his efforts, trailing Mary through employment agencies and boarding houses, only to find that she kept moving. Cooks changed jobs frequently, and Mary, aware now that she was being hunted, was even more elusive. When Soper appeared at one address, Mary had slipped out a side door. When he checked another, she'd left the day before. New York's grid, usually a gift to pursuers, turned into a labyrinth of service entrances and basement rooms that made slipping away easy. At this point, Soper realized he needed official backing. He took his files to the New York City Health Department and found an ally in Dr. Sarah Josephine Baker, a formidable physician and administrator with little patience for evasions, microbial or human. With Baker's involvement, the "please provide samples" request hardened into a public health order. But orders still needed a subject to serve them on, and Mary was proving as difficult to pin down as any pickpocket on the Bowery. The second confrontation was less genteel. Baker and officers headed to an address where Mary was believed to be staying. Accounts differ in small details, but the gist is consistent. Mary ran. She bolted through rooms, outdoors, down steps. New Yorker's obstacle course. The pursuit spilled into the back alleys and service yards that stitched together the city's private lives. In one famous version of the story, Mary hid in a closet or behind ash barrels in a yard, silent and furious while searchers passed within feet of her. When they found her at last, it took a scuffle to bring the confrontation to a close. Even in custody, Mary held her line. No admission, no samples offered willingly, no agreement to the idea that she, healthy, strong, self-supporting, could be a menace. From her perspective, she was being hounded by cranks with newfangled ideas about invisible creatures. From Soper's and Baker's perspective, they were trying to keep families out of fever beds. The clash felt personal because it was individual liberty on one side, collective safety on the other, played out in tenement hallways and carriage rides to city hospitals. In practical terms, Soper got what he wanted. With Mary under official control, samples could be taken and tested. In human terms, the price was high. Mary felt betrayed and cornered. The investigators felt vindicated, but now responsible for a woman who did not believe in the very premise of their work. The chase through Manhattan ended not with a gentleman's handshake, but with a forced ride toward medical isolation, and with it the next chapter of the story. Quarantine, controversy, and the birth of a tabloid legend began to write itself. Mary Mallon's capture and forced testing marked a dramatic turning point, not only in her personal life, but also in the young science of epidemiology. The laboratory results confirmed what George Soper had suspected all along. Her stool samples teemed with Salmonella typhi. To the health department, the case was closed. The data was plain, the logic airtight. Mary was a danger to the public. But to Mary herself, those results meant nothing. She felt perfectly healthy, never once bedridden by the fevers that racked her former employers. How could numbers on a doctor's chart outweigh the evidence of her own strong body? This clash, data versus denial, lay at the heart of her story. Public health officials operated in a world where invisible microbes, mapped through cultures and microscopes, carried more authority than personal testimony. Mary, like many ordinary people of her era, trusted experience. She had never been sick, therefore she could not possibly be a source of disease. To her, the accusations were not just insulting, they were absurd. And when scientists and city officials demanded that she accept their conclusions, she dug in her heels. The tension wasn't unique to Mary. Epidemiology was still a relatively new discipline in the early 1900s, and its claims often clashed with common sense. The idea of healthy carriers was unsettling even to some physicians who struggled to reconcile the concept with traditional understandings of disease. If someone looked well, worked hard, and showed no outward symptoms, how could they be spreading illness? It upended centuries of medical assumption where fever, rash, or weakness had been the visible tickets to diagnosis. Yet the laboratory data was undeniable. Repeated tests showed the same result. Salmonella typhi lived in Mary's intestines, especially her gallbladder, and left her body in massive numbers. The bacteria didn't need her to be sick. They only needed her to handle food. From a scientific perspective, she was a walking reservoir. From her perspective, she was a scapegoat. After all, dozens of other cooks worked in New York kitchens under conditions just as unsanitary. Why was she, an immigrant woman with little power or money, being singled out? That question touched a raw nerve in the city's social fabric. Irish immigrants like Mary were already viewed with suspicion by many in the Anglo-American elite. Her fiery temper and refusal to back down only reinforced the stereotype of the difficult Irish woman. The tabloids feasted on it, branding her Typhoid Mary and turning her into both a public menace and a public spectacle. To Mary, the headlines were further proof that she was being persecuted unfairly. To the health officials, the publicity was a double-edged sword. It frightened people into taking carriers seriously, but it also made Mary dig deeper into her defiance. The result was a standoff. On North Brother Island, where Mary was quarantined, the city ran tests and compiled statistics. Doctors and inspectors saw the results as crystal clear. Mary remained unconvinced, insisting the tests were flawed or the samples contaminated or the doctors simply mistaken. No amount of data could compete with her lived reality. The more the officials pressed, the more she resisted, and the conflict hardened into principle. For Mary, it was about her freedom and dignity. For the city, it was about protecting lives. In many ways, her case foreshadowed public health battles that still echo today. How much authority should the state have to control individuals for the sake of community safety? What happens when personal liberty collides with statistical risk? And how do you persuade someone who denies the science when the science itself is invisible to the naked eye? For George Soper and his colleagues, Mary Mallon became both proof and problem. She demonstrated the reality of carriers, a breakthrough that shaped the future of epidemiology. But she also embodied the human cost of imposing science on an unwilling subject. The conflict between data and denial, authority and autonomy, made her case infamous. Not just a medical mystery solved, but a public drama still debated more than a century later. The standoff between Mary Mallon and New York's health officials could not last forever. After weeks of chasing her through boarding houses and kitchens, the city decided that persuasion had failed. The data was in, the danger was clear, and Mary's refusal to cooperate made her a public health emergency. What followed was less a polite medical intervention than a spectacle of forcible removal, the kind of scene that to aid to fear about government power and individual liberty in the modern age. The arrest began with Dr. Sarah Josephine Baker, one of the city's most determined public health officers. Baker was already well known for work with immigrant communities and her campaigns to lower infant mortality. But now she found herself in the unusual position of having to capture a cook who simply would not surrender. Baker later recalled that Mary fought like a wild creature, and the comparison, while unkind, captured the raw energy of the moment. Mary was cornered, humiliated and terrified. She did not believe she was guilty of anything. So when officials arrived at her door with police officers in tow, she reacted as anyone might when facing what she saw as injustice. She resisted. Accounts differ slightly in the details, but the broad strokes are consistent. Mary bolted from her kitchen, slipping through a side door and sprinting down narrow alleys. Officers chased her across yards and through stairwells. At one point, she is said to have hidden in a closet, crouched behind cleaning supplies as searchers pounded past. At another, she allegedly wedged herself into an outhouse, hoping the stench would keep pursuers at bay. It didn't. After hours of cat and mouse, she was discovered, furious and unyielding. Dragging Mary into custody was no small feat. It reportedly took several officers to wrestle her into a waiting ambulance, where she continued to struggle so fiercely that Baker had to sit on her during the ride to keep her restrained. Imagine the scene. A horse-drawn ambulance clattering over cobblestones, rocking with each of Mary's thrashes, while a doctor in a stiff skirt and hat tried to keep her pinned. The tabloids could hardly have scripted it better. The destination was North Brother Island, a windswept piece of land in the East River, already home to Riverside Hospital, which specialised in contagious diseases. For most New Yorkers, it was a place of no return, a liminal zone between the bustling city and the shadow of death. Mary, still shouting her innocence, was ferried across the water under guard, her life as a free working woman left behind on the Manhattan shore. The decision to remove her forcibly was controversial from the start. Public health law gave the city authority to quarantine dangerous individuals, but Mary's case was unique. She was not visibly ill. To her supporters, it looked like government overreach, punishing a woman for a crime she couldn't even feel in her own body. To health officials, the matter was painfully simple. She was a proven source of deadly outbreaks. Allowing her to continue cooking meant more funerals. By the time she arrived at Riverside Hospital, Mary Mallon was already infamous. The press had gotten hold of the story, christening her Typhoid Mary in bold, sensational headlines. Cartoons depicted her cracking skulls into frying pans, germs leaping from her fingertips. The imagery cemented her in the public imagination as both villain and curiosity. Yet the woman at the centre of it all remained adamant. She was healthy, she was innocent, and she was being treated unjustly. This clash between the city's duty to protect the many and Mary's insistence on her own liberty set the tone for everything that followed. North Brother Island would become her reluctant home, and the debate over whether she belonged there would rage in newspapers, courtrooms and medical journals alike. The capture was over, but the controversy had only begun. When Mary Mallon arrived at Riverside Hospital on North Brother Island, the debate about her guilt shifted from alleyway chases and tabloid headlines to petri dishes and lab notebooks. If public health officials were going to justify quarantining a woman who felt perfectly fine, they needed something firmer than SOPA's timelines. They needed repeatable, laboratory evidence that Salmonella typhi was passing through Mary's body. So they set up a routine that would have felt both clinical and humiliating. Regular collection of stool and urine, careful labelling, and a steady ferry of specimens from isolation ward to city laboratory. Turn-of-the-century bacteriology didn't have the speed of modern PCR tests, but it did have a clear playbook. Technicians plated samples on culture media, incubated them and watched for colonies that matched the behaviour of typhoid bacilli. Suspicious growths were prodded and tested, sometimes with rudimentary biochemical reactions and agglutination methods, to separate Salmonella typhi from its lookalike cousins. It was slow, methodical work, closer to gardening than CSI, but it was also powerful. When the same result appears again and again, doubt shrinks. And that is exactly what happened. Over weeks and then months, Mary's stool cultures repeatedly came back positive for Salmonella typhi. Not every single sample. It's the nature of carriers that shedding can wax and wane, but enough, and often enough, to erase the comforting theory of a one-off mix-up. A bad batch of media can explain one result. A sloppy label can ruin a day's work. Even the best lab can have a fluke. But a drumbeat of positives across time looks less like coincidence and more like a diagnosis. To Mary, the numbers meant little. She clung to her experience. She was robust. She had never suffered the delirium or rash associated with typhoid, and she had outcooked half the kitchens in New York without so much as a day in bed. So she argued with the premise. Maybe the samples were contaminated, maybe the doctors were biased, maybe the lab was wrong. And, not unreasonably, she pointed out that the city's sanitation problems were bigger than one Irish cook. Why, she asked, was she the face of a disease that flowed through sewers and tenements? The doctors countered with a simple clinical logic. Visible illness was not required for transmission. The bacterium could live quietly in a person's gallbladder or intestinal tract, spilling into stool even when the host felt fine. Because Mary prepared food, often uncooked dishes, the bacteria had a direct route to dinner plates. The lab cultures turned that explanation from theory into evidence. Each positive plate was a tiny courtroom exhibit. Exhibit A, Exhibit B, Exhibit C, all pointing to the same conclusion. There were complicating details, and they mattered. Intermittent negatives gave Mary ammunition. See, clean! And forced the staff to explain that carriers can shed in bursts. The hospital also tried to standardise everything that could be standardised. The same containers, the same handling, the same clerks writing the same tidy script on every label. Chain of custody became not just a bureaucratic habit, but a shield against Mary's charge that someone was stacking the deck. The routine itself, tedious, relentless, was part of the proof. As the positive results piled up, physicians proposed a definitive fix. Remove Mary's gallbladder, the suspected reservoir. Cholecystectomy in the early 1900s was no minor suggestion. Surgery carried real risk and consent was required. Mary refused. From her perspective, the doctors were asking to cut her open based on lab reports she didn't believe. From theirs, they were offering a path back to freedom. The stalemate held. Meanwhile, the press kept turning science into spectacle. Headlines boiled the lab work down to a caricature. Typhoid Mary still poisonous, or cartoons with germs leaping from frying pans. That coverage hardened positions. Public fear made officials double down on caution. Public shaming made Mary dig in deeper. In quieter moments, the hospital tried the lifestyle approach, hand-washing lectures, promises to help her find non-cooking work if released, strict hygiene guidelines. But even those plans assumed a basic agreement on facts, and Mary did not grant that premise. Inside the hospital's ledgers, though, the case had crossed a line. Repeated positive cultures gathered under controlled routines supported a formal diagnosis. Mary Mallon was a chronic typhoid carrier. In the language of the day, she was a healthy carrier, but healthy only in the maddeningly literal sense. To families across Manhattan and Long Island, the lab reports explained summers derailed and children lost. To public health officials, they justified quarantine. To Mary, they were ink and accusation. The result was a paradox that still feels modern. The more the data stacked up, the more the subject at the centre rejected it. Science had given authorities a rational framework. Identify carriers, interrupt transmission, save lives. Yet the human story remained stubbornly irrational. A proud worker, a stigmatizing nickname, invasive sampling, and a diagnosis that demanded she abandon the trade that fed her. The petri dishes had spoken, but the person had not been persuaded. Which set the stage for the next conflict. If the evidence said danger, how long could the city hold one woman to protect everyone else? The answer would unfold in court filings, conditional promises, and eventually a second act that proved even more contentious than the first. By the time the lab notebooks declared Mary Mallon a chronic carrier, the story had escaped the hospital and landed on every breakfast table in New York. The press did what the press does. It turned a complicated public health problem into a character with a nickname. Typhoid Mary fit neatly into a headline, the kind of label that sells papers and sticks to a person forever. Cartoonists drew her as a grim cook sprinkling skulls like pepper over a frying pan. Editors paired her name with words like menace, menial, and murderous, alliteration doing the heavy lifting that nuance could not. Sensational coverage served a purpose. Fear can motivate hygiene and policy, but it flattened the real women in the story into stock figures. The tireless lady doctor, the relentless sleuth, and the villainous cook. It also hardened public opinion into two noisy camps. On one side stood readers who saw Mary as a ticking bomb, proof that the city had to get tough to stop invisible killers. On the other were civil libertarians, labour advocates, and ordinary immigrants who looked at Mary and saw the risks of state power aimed downward. Why, they asked? Did the full weight of quarantine fall on one Irish domestic worker, while the city dragged its feet on fixing contaminated tenements and leaky sewers? Newspapers loved that friction. Profiles of Dr. Sarah Josephine Baker leaned into the image of a modern woman of science protecting families from a stubborn cook. Features on George Soper cast him as a rational detective, chasing facts through kitchens and boarding houses. And then there was Mary, whose own voice rarely made it to print without translation. When interviews did appear, they often highlighted her temper or her refusal to accept the carrier diagnosis, turning scepticism into defiance, scepticism plus an accent into danger. The effect on policy was swift. With every alarming headline, officials could point to public demand for action. Quarantine felt justified, even inevitable, but public sympathy is a slippery thing, and it never lined up perfectly with the loudest front pages. Letters trickled in from readers who asked uncomfortable questions. If the hospital's tests showed intermittent negatives, didn't that introduce doubt? If surgery was risky, was it fair to pressure Mary into it? If carriers existed, weren't there likely many more, quietly delivering milk or scrubbing pans without the benefit or burden of a newspaper nickname? Mary's lawyers tried to court that sympathy. In petitions and interviews, they stressed her humanity, a working woman who had never been sick, now confined on an island because of lab results she didn't trust, and a job she was told she could never do again. They pointed out that the city had released other suspected carriers under conditions, no cooking, regular check-ins, while Mary remained the outlier, making example outpace equity. The phrase Typhoid Mary, they argued, did not describe a diagnosis so much as it produced a stigma. But stigma has momentum. It turns policies into morality plays. If Mary was Typhoid Mary, then release looked like negligence and compassion like risk. The tabloids helpfully kept score, splashing any new outbreak across their front pages with strategic reminders of the cook on North Brother Island. In this environment, subtlety died. Every lab-positive culture became a headline. Every appeal read like special pleading. That didn't mean the public was immune to her story. Visitors to the island, reporters, clergy, reformers, sometimes came away unsettled. In person, Mary was not a cartoon. She was a skilled worker with pride in her craft, angry at her captors and convinced she was being wronged. She kept a dog, tended small routines, cooked for herself under supervision. The gap between her ordinary habits and the extraordinary fear attached to her name created cognitive whiplash. People left asking the question the headlines refused to hold still. How do you balance one woman's liberty and livelihood against a city's safety? The answer the city preferred was conditional mercy. If Mary would accept the science, give up cooking forever and comply with monitoring, perhaps she could leave the island. That proposal depended on two fragile things, trust and reputation. Trust, because Mary had to believe that officials were acting fairly and that she would be treated like others in similar straits. Reputation, because the moment she stepped off the ferry, every cough in New York would be laid at her door. A single rumour could send her back across the water. So Typhoid Mary remained both a headline and a human being, trapped between press narratives and public health protocols. The nickname made her legible to a frightened city. It also made her release politically hazardous. In that tension lay the real drama of the case. Science had given officials a new tool, carrier identification, but science could not tell newspapers what to print or voters how to feel. Mary's fate would hinge on something messier, whether a city could see past the caricature it had created and negotiate a future in which she could live, safely and without a frying pan in her hand. From there, the stage was set for a compromise, paper promises, conditional freedom, and an uneasy truce with the front pages. It would hold for a time, and then, as so often happens when human need collides with public fear, the story would circle back, to the only place it could, a kitchen. Mary Mallon's story shifted once again when the city ferried her across the East River to North Brother Island. If the headlines had cast her as a menace, the island made her a captive. Riverside Hospital stood at the centre of the small windswept plot, its brick buildings and long porches designed for fresh air, convalescence and containment. To most New Yorkers, North Brother was already notorious as a place where smallpox patients, diphtheria cases and other contagions were sent out of sight. For Mary, it became both her home and her prison. Life there was rigidly structured. The grounds were fenced and patrolled, and visitors needed official permission to come and go. Mary lived in a small cottage separate from the main wards, a concession to the fact that she wasn't sick and didn't belong among fever patients. But the separation also deepened her isolation. She had neighbours of a sort, nurses, orderlies, and the occasional doctor checking in with a clipboard. But she did not have family around her table or the hum of a city street outside her door. For a woman used to the bustle of kitchens and the rhythm of Manhattan households, the quiet was oppressive. Rules governed everything. Mary was barred from leaving the island without explicit approval. She could not take a cooking job. Her old profession was permanently closed to her. Doctors insisted she submit to regular testing, each request a reminder of the invisible enemy they believed lived inside her. Hand-washing instructions, dietary recommendations, and lectures on hygiene became part of her daily routine, delivered with clinical authority but received with growing resentment. To her mind, she had done nothing wrong, and yet her days were scheduled like those of a convict. The island itself was paradoxical, beautiful in moments, bleak in purpose. From her cottage, Mary could see the skyline of New York glimmering in the distance, ferries and barges cutting across the water. The city was close enough to remind her of freedom, yet completely out of reach. Gardens and walking paths offered a semblance of normal life, but the fences and watchful staff made it clear she was not free to choose where to walk or how far to wander. The hospital's mission was health, but for Mary, the island meant confinement. She filled her days with small routines. She cared for a dog that became her companion, tended to her own meals, and maintained the habits of a household worker who had always taken pride in keeping things neat. She cooked for herself, though even this was an irony. Authorities claimed she was too dangerous to cook for others, but they allowed her to handle her own food. She also wrote letters, sometimes to friends, sometimes to newspapers, always insisting on her innocence. In her writing, she painted herself as a victim of persecution, a working woman scapegoated for flaws in the city's sanitation system. Doctors saw it differently. To them, North Brother Island was the safest compromise. Mary was comfortable, they argued, compared to the patients in the fever wards. She was housed, fed, and freedom of movement within the grounds. She was not strapped to a bed or locked in a cell. They described her as stubborn, unwilling to listen, and dangerously uncooperative. The island kept her out of kitchens and away from unsuspecting families, a necessary safeguard. The press kept the tension alive. Some articles described Mary's cottage life as cosy, others as pitiful. The nickname Typhoid Mary followed her across the water, turning every report into a mix of human interest and public warning. For reformers and civil libertarians, her isolation became a cause célèbre. Was it fair to confine a woman who had never been sick? For public health officials, the question was rhetorical. Each new outbreak on the mainland only reinforced their decision to keep her in quarantine. North Brother Island embodied the contradictions of Mary's case. It was a hospital, but she was not a patient. It was a refuge from the city, but she did not come by choice. It offered safety for the public, but it demanded sacrifice from one individual. Day after day, year after year, Mary lived with the skyline in view and the water as a barrier. The debate about her freedom played out in courtrooms and newspapers, but the reality of her life was measured in the monotony of island routines. And yet, even in this enforced stillness, the story did not end. Pressure from lawyers, reformers, and public opinion would eventually push the city toward compromise. For Mary, that meant the possibility of leaving the island on conditions she could not fully accept and with a reputation she could never escape. The next chapter would not be about her confinement, but about the uneasy experiment of freedom for a woman the world now knew only as Typhoid Mary. Even as Mary Mallon settled into the routines of North Brother Island, she never accepted her quarantine as legitimate. To her, it was not science but persecution that kept her cut off from the city just across the river, and so she began to fight back in the only ways available to her, with letters, lawyers, and the slow grind of appeals through the courts. If the doctors thought data would silence her, Mary was determined to answer with words. Her letters reveal a voice at once indignant and bewildered. She wrote to newspapers insisting she had never been sick, that she was being scapegoated for the city's wider sanitation failures. She compared her treatment to imprisonment without trial, pointing out that murderers were given hearings while she had simply been whisked away to an island. "I am kept like a dog," she complained, echoing both the loneliness of her confinement and her sense of being dehumanized by officials who spoke about her in petri dish counts rather than human terms. For every laboratory report that declared her a carrier, she offered her body as counterproof. Strong, healthy, alive. Lawyers took up her case, some out of sympathy, others out of a belief that the city had exceeded its authority. The central question was thorny. Could the government legally confine someone indefinitely who had committed no crime and shown no symptoms, simply because science predicted she posed a risk? The city argued that public health law gave them broad power to prevent outbreaks. Mary's attorneys countered that this was arbitrary detention, a dangerous precedent in a democracy. If one woman could be locked away based on probabilities, who else might be next? In 1909, Mary's case reached the New York Supreme Court through a writ of habeas corpus. It was her chance to challenge the health department's authority and win her release. The courtroom drama was sharp. City lawyers pointed to the repeated positive stool cultures, the maps of outbreaks, the testimony of doctors like Soper and Baker. Mary's side emphasised her humanity, her rights, and the lack of direct evidence linking her to every case. They also highlighted the inconsistent lab results, some negative, some positive, as proof that the science was not as ironclad as officials claimed. The press swarmed the story, gleefully reporting every detail. Editorials split along predictable lines. Some painted her as a reckless menace who would scatter death for wages if released. Others sympathised with her as a working-class woman bullied by elite scientists and bureaucrats. The nickname Typhoid Mary appeared in almost every article, both undermining her legal arguments and cementing her as a household name. For the public, she was less a person than a symbol of the uneasy balance between individual rights and collective safety. In the end, the courts sided with the city. The ruling was clear. The health department had the authority to quarantine carriers in the interest of public health. Mary would remain on North Brother Island. The defeat was crushing. Her appeals had stirred sympathy but had not broken the legal framework arrayed against her. For officials, the decision was a victory for science and civic protection. For Mary, it was confirmation that the system was rigged. Still, the campaign was not for nothing. The legal battle and media attention forced the city to consider the ethics of indefinite confinement. Reformers argued that Mary should be released under conditions, barred from cooking, monitored periodically, perhaps even retrained for other work. They pointed out that other identified carriers were being managed this way, quietly integrated back into the city. Why was Mary different? The answer lay partly in her notoriety. Having been cast as Typhoid Mary, she was too visible to handle with quiet discretion. Any new outbreak near her name would be a political disaster. For Mary herself, the years of writing and appealing built a dual identity. On the island, she was an isolated cook with a dog for company. In the city, she was a headline, a court case, a symbol in editorials. Her letters tried to bridge the gap, insisting that she was more than a diagnosis. But the law had spoken, and for now, the bars of quarantine remained. Still, cracks were beginning to show. Behind the scenes, health officials debated whether indefinite isolation was truly sustainable. Pressure from reformers and the simple awkwardness of keeping one woman locked away for life nudged them toward compromise. Eventually, the city would decide to test a new idea: conditional release. It was a gamble, both for Mary and for the public. And like most gambles in her story, It would prove anything but simple. Mary Mallon's failed appeal left her exactly where she had started, on North Brother Island, looking across the water at a city that had decided it could not risk her return. Yet the legal ruling did not erase the unease felt by the people charged with overseeing her confinement. Doctors, nurses, and administrators found themselves caught between sympathy for a woman who seemed perfectly healthy and fear of the consequences if she were released. That tension gave Mary's case a peculiar weight inside the hospital, where her presence became a daily reminder of the ethical grey zone public health was entering. On paper, the science was clear. Mary's stool cultures came back positive again and again. Epidemiological sleuthing tied her to outbreaks. If you believed the data, the case was closed. But science does not carry bedpans or deliver meals. The nurses who interacted with her day after day saw not a menace, but a stubborn, sometimes lonely woman who cooked her own food, walked the grounds, and doted on a small dog. She was not coughing, not feverish, not wasting away. To the staff who worked beside tuberculosis patients and diphtheria victims, Mary stood out as an anomaly, the well patient who could never leave. That dissonance troubled some physicians too. Public health demanded sacrifice, but indefinite sacrifice by one individual raised uncomfortable questions. Was it right to confine her without end when other carriers were being released under supervision? Was she being punished less for her biology than for her defiance and her tabloid nickname? Even Dr. Sarah Josephine Baker, who had overseen Mary's capture, later admitted she felt ambivalent. She believed Mary was dangerous, yet she also recognised the unfairness of making her the lone example in a city teeming with hidden carriers. Fear, however, had its own gravity. Typhoid outbreaks still scarred New York, and the public expected officials to act decisively. If Mary were released and another cluster appeared, the health department would bear the blame. The nurses could pity her, the doctors could debate the philosophy of quarantine, but the administrators knew they had to manage risk, and Mary was risk personified. Her refusal to admit the diagnosis or agree to give up cooking made her an especially thorny case. How could the department trust her to follow rules when she didn't believe the rules applied? This tension shaped daily life on the island. Staff enforced hygiene lectures that Mary dismissed. They collected samples she resented. They kept her confined while debating in medical journals whether such confinement was ethical. Mary, meanwhile, fumed at what she saw as hypocrisy. She was imprisoned while wealthier, more discreet carriers were allowed to negotiate their freedom. The double standard was plain. Her notoriety had made her the face of the problem, and faces cannot slip quietly back into the crowd. The ethics of her detention rippled outward. Reformers cited her case in arguments about civil liberties. Medical conferences used her as a cautionary tale, but also as a warning about the dangers of overreach. Public health officials began to realise that raw authority was not enough. Carriers needed to be managed in ways that balanced safety with fairness. Mary's situation highlighted the limits of a system still learning how to handle people who lived at the border between sickness and health. For the staff who saw her most, the experience was human, not abstract. They witnessed her temper, yes, but also her pride and her loneliness. They watched her resist every attempt at compromise and yet keep her cottage spotless. They heard her insist she was being wronged, and even if they disagreed, they understood why she felt that way. Sympathy could not cancel the fear of typhoid, but fear could not erase the sympathy either. The result was an uneasy coexistence, a stalemate written into the daily rhythms of the island. This fragile balance could not hold forever. Pressure mounted from reformers, the press, and even within the department itself to find another path. Holding one woman indefinitely, year after year, while admitting there were surely dozens of other carriers living freely, was becoming harder to defend. Eventually, the city would craft a compromise: release Mary under strict conditions. It was a gamble rooted in both sympathy and fear, and it set the stage for the next, more complicated chapter of her story. By 1910, the stalemate over Mary Mallon had dragged on long enough to make even New York's health officials uneasy. Keeping one woman locked away indefinitely was expensive, controversial, and increasingly hard to justify when other identified typhoid carriers were quietly living in the city under supervision. Reformers and sympathetic journalists pressed the department. Surely there was a middle ground between absolute freedom and indefinite quarantine. Under that pressure, the city decided to take a calculated risk. Mary would be released, conditionally. The term sounded simple on paper. Mary could return to the mainland, but she had to agree never to work as a cook again. Instead, she would need to find employment in laundry, cleaning, or other domestic service that did not involve preparing food. She was also expected to check in regularly with the health department, submit samples when asked, and follow strict hygiene rules. The arrangement was meant to balance public safety with a measure of personal liberty. If she kept her word, she could live outside the fences of North Brother Island. From the city's perspective, this was mercy. From Mary's, it was humiliation. Cooking was not just her trade, it was her identity. She had spent years honing her skills in wealthy households, rising above the more menial rungs of domestic labour. To strip that away was, in her eyes, a deliberate act of punishment. Laundry and cleaning were lower status, back-breaking jobs, poorly paid compared to the wages a talented cook could command. Yet if she wanted her freedom, she had no choice but to accept. So she signed the papers, boarded the ferry, and stepped back into New York with the weight of conditions hanging over her. At first, Mary complied. She found work in laundries and did her best to keep a low profile. But the economic reality quickly set in. Laundry work was grueling, the hours long, the pay dismal. She struggled to support herself in the way she had before. Employers often preferred younger or less outspoken workers, leaving Mary in her 40s with fewer options. The health department's rules, meanwhile, made her feel watched and mistrusted. Each requested sample, each reminder of hygiene stoked her resentment. She still did not believe she was dangerous, and she grew tired of living under what felt like permanent suspicion. The city, for its part, considered the arrangement a success, at least at first. Officials could point to Mary's release as proof of balance. The health department was not unreasonable, it said, and could temper science with compassion. But beneath the public relations win was a brittle reality. Mary had not been persuaded of the science, only forced to comply with its consequences. Without genuine belief in her carrier status, her promise not to cook rested on shaky ground. Friends and acquaintances noticed her bitterness. She complained that she had been treated unfairly, that she had been made into an example for the newspapers, while countless other carriers walked free. And she was not wrong. Doctors themselves acknowledged that dozens, perhaps hundreds, of asymptomatic typhoid carriers likely lived in New York. Few, if any, were confined as she had been. But they also lacked her notoriety. Mary's name had become shorthand for invisible danger, and that made her situation unique. Still, notoriety did not pay the rent. Over time, the temptation to return to cooking grew stronger. It was the work she knew, the work that paid better, and the work that gave her a sense of worth. To Mary, it likely felt less like breaking a promise than reclaiming her dignity. After all, she had never believed the promise was based on truth. The city said she carried germs. She said she did not. Why, then, should she obey rules she considered unjust? Thus, the stage was set for relapse. For a few brief years, Mary Mallon lived outside the fences of North Brother Island, bound by conditions she neither respected nor believed in. To health officials, it was a chance to test whether public safety and personal freedom could coexist. To Mary, it was a chance to regain some control over her life. But control is hard to maintain when the conditions of freedom clash so completely with one's identity and survival. Before long, the uneasy truce would collapse, and the story of Typhoid Mary would erupt once again, this time with even greater consequences. When conditional freedom collided with New York rent, Mary Mallon did what many workers do under pressure. She reached for the skill that actually paid. Laundry work was punishing and poorly compensated. A skilled cook could earn multiples of a washerwoman's wages, plus room and board in respectable households. So Mary drifted toward kitchens again, cautiously at first, then more decisively, slipping back into the labour market under assumed names. Mary Brown, Marie, or no surname at all, the aliases were flimsy disguises, but in a city crowded with servants and constant turnover, they worked often enough. The strategy was simple: avoid agencies that had her on a watch list, answer ads directly, take short stints, leave before anyone got too curious, and never mention North Brother Island. This was not a grand conspiracy so much as a piecemeal hustle. Employers needed cooks yesterday, references were perfunctory, the velocity of domestic service meant a new face in the kitchen didn't draw much attention. If anyone asked about her past, Mary kept it vague. Plenty of homes, lots of experience, ready to start immediately. Back in a white apron, Mary did what had once made her sought after. She produced appealing food quickly and confidently. But the very strengths that raised her wages raised the public risk. Her repertoire still leaned toward cold dishes, custards, salads, ices, the very foods least likely to get a sterilizing boil. And because she still did not accept the carrier diagnosis, the hygiene rules that might have reduced danger felt to her like performative scolding. She wasn't deliberately reckless, she was unconvinced. In her mind, clean kitchen, clean hands, healthy body, case closed. Secrecy came with costs. Mary had to keep moving. A nosy housemaid who recognised her nickname in a newspaper cartoon, a butler who heard a rumour from a friend in another house, an employer who insisted on references. Any of these could end a placement overnight. So she cycled through addresses, working a few weeks or months, then slipping away to the next doorstep. The itinerant pattern echoed her pre-island employment, but now the clock ticked louder. Every day in a kitchen risked discovery by the health department and, more dangerously, another cluster of fevers that would point back to the cook. Domestic service, ironically, helped her. New York's private homes formed a fragmented world of back staircases and basement entrances. Cooks and maids belonged to a shadow city with its own gossip network, but little in the way of centralized records. A competent cook could vanish from one household and appear in another a trolley ride away with no one the wiser. That informality, so useful to employers who like to hire on impulse, also let Mary stay one step ahead. Money was the bluntest motivator. Wages from cooking meant better rooms, steadier meals, and a sense of status she never found in a steam-filled laundry. Pride mattered too. Mary believed she was being punished for a crime she hadn't committed, and returning to her trade felt like moral correction as much as economic necessity. If the city had wronged her, why should she honour a promise extracted under duress? This is not to excuse the consequences, only to explain the calculus from Mary's side of the ledger. But consequences arrived. Kitchens where she worked began to see familiar symptoms: headaches, fever, intestinal distress. In some places, only a servant fell ill and the matter passed without headlines. In others, several cases appeared in quick succession. Investigators who traced food handlers eventually found a new cook whose face felt uncannily familiar. Sometimes she would be gone before anyone asked questions. Sometimes a wary employer dismissed the staff and quietly hired replacements, chalking it up to bad luck. The pattern that had once built the case against her began to reassemble itself, this time under assumed names. Health officials, for their part, were not entirely surprised. They had released a woman who did not accept their science and who had been famous precisely for resisting it. Still, they hoped the threat of re-quarantine would keep her out of kitchens. It didn't. The city's surveillance tools were limited to tips, inspections, and the occasional lucky lead from an agency clerk. Mary's mobility outpaced their paperwork. New York was a city of constant arrivals and departures. One determined cook could disappear into the churn for months. Inevitably, though, one job lasted long enough and one outbreak grew large enough to bring everything crashing down. When typhoid cases erupted at a maternity hospital, an institution that could not quietly shelve a scandal, the search for the source turned urgent and public. A cook who signed in as Mary Brown drew particular attention. The lines connected, the alias peeled back, and the department realised that its most famous carrier had returned to the very work she had promised to abandon. The discovery made the earlier compromise look naive. It also hardened official attitudes. Where the first quarantine had been framed as a reluctant necessity, the second began to look, in the department's view, like a regrettable inevitability. Mary's economic pressures and sense of injustice were real, so were the patients in fever wards. The city forged ahead toward a new confrontation, this time with even less patience for negotiation and far less faith in paper promises. From that point, back to the kitchen, ceased to be a private strategy and became a public scandal. The aliases unravelled, the headlines returned, and Mary Mallon, never persuaded, always resourceful, stood once again at the collision point between individual livelihood and communal risk, with the East River Ferry waiting in the wings. By 1915, Mary Mallon had been living under the radar for nearly 5 years, drifting from kitchen to kitchen under borrowed names. The city's health department suspected she might have slipped back into cooking, but in a city of 5 million people, suspicion was hard to prove. What finally exposed her wasn't a boarding house family or a wealthy summer retreat, but a hospital, an institution where records were kept, patients were counted, and outbreaks could not be brushed aside. The Sloan Maternity Hospital, one of New York's most respected facilities for mothers and newborns, became the stage for the scandal that ended Mary's second act of freedom. The outbreak began quietly. In the spring of 1915, patients and staff at Sloan started falling ill with typhoid symptoms, fever, abdominal pain, and the slow exhaustion that made even routine care impossible. At first, doctors thought it might be a fluke, a contaminated water source, or a bad batch of milk. But as case after case appeared, the alarm grew. Hospitals prided themselves on sanitation, especially maternity wards, where vulnerable mothers and infants were supposed to be shielded from the very diseases rampant in tenements. To see typhoid stalking the halls of Sloan was both humiliating and frightening. Investigators moved quickly. They checked the plumbing, the milk supply, the food deliveries. Nothing obvious surfaced. Then attention turned, as it so often did, to the kitchen staff. Among them was a middle-aged Irish cook who had signed in as Mary Brown. She had been hired not long before the first cases appeared. For those familiar with New York's typhoid history, the name raised eyebrows. Mary Brown was a common enough alias, but the details, the timing, the background, the dishes she prepared felt uncannily familiar. Once suspicions hardened, the investigation proceeded like déjà vu. Records were traced, references checked, and soon the thin disguise unravelled. Mary Brown was none other than Mary Mallon, the city's most famous carrier, who had promised in 1910 never to work in a kitchen again. The discovery was explosive. This wasn't just another outbreak. It was proof that the woman the city had once quarantined and then released under conditions had violated her agreement and endangered lives again. The numbers sealed the case. At least 25 people were infected in the Sloan outbreak, including both staff and patients. Several died. In the delicate environment of a maternity hospital where mothers and infants were already at risk, the consequences felt especially stark. Typhoid was not an abstract public health threat. It was now linked to lost lives in a place meant to deliver them safely. For health officials, the moral equation that had seemed debatable during Mary's first quarantine suddenly felt obvious. The risk of release was too high. Public reaction was swift and merciless. Headlines resurrected Typhoid Mary with renewed vigour. Editorial cartoons once again showed her scattering skulls or serving death on platters. The narrative was simple. Given a chance at freedom, she had betrayed the city's trust. Sympathetic voices grew quieter. Even reformers who had once argued for her release struggled to defend her after Sloan. The press cast her not as a victim of circumstance, but as a repeat offender, a living example of why public health rules had to be enforced. For Mary herself, the exposure was catastrophic. She had been trying to survive to reclaim a trade that gave her both income and a dignity. But survival collided with surveillance, and her choice to return to kitchens made her an easy target when tragedy struck. Whether she ever accepted the science or not, the evidence was now too public and too deadly to ignore. The city moved decisively. Mary was tracked down, arrested once more, and ferried back to North Brother Island. This time there would be no conditions, no second release, no negotiated freedom. The Sloan maternity outbreak had erased the last traces of doubt. Mary Mallon would live out the rest of her days in quarantine, her name forever bound to the disease she never believed she carried. From this moment forward, Typhoid Mary was no longer just a sensational headline, but a cautionary tale taught in medical schools and public health lectures. Her case became a turning point in how the city and the nation understood carriers, quarantine, and the uneasy balance between individual rights and collective safety. And for Mary herself, it meant the end of her life in the city she had once navigated with skill and stubborn pride. The ferry had carried her to North Brother before, but this time everyone knew it was a one-way trip. The second arrest of Mary Mallon in 1915 left little doubt about her personal fate, but the larger questions raised by her case were far from settled. Her return to North Brother Island dramatised an issue that had been simmering for years. How far could the state go in the name of protecting public health? The Progressive Era was a time of expanding government authority with new agencies, new regulations, and new expectations that science and the state could work hand in hand to improve society. But it was also a period when civil libertarians, labour activists, and immigrant communities worried about how those same powers might be used, especially against the poor, the foreign-born, and the politically powerless. Mary Mallon stood right at the intersection of these debates. The legal foundation for her quarantine rested on what lawyers and judges called the police power of the state. Unlike the police force in uniform, police power referred to the government's broad authority to safeguard the health, safety and welfare of its citizens. Rooted in English common law and refined in American courts during the 19th century, it gave states and municipalities the ability to enforce health codes, regulate businesses, and when necessary, quarantine individuals. In theory, it was the legal backbone of public health. Without it, cities could not close contaminated wells, order vaccinations, or isolate dangerous cases. But the exercise of that power always rubbed against civil rights. The Constitution guaranteed due process, equal protection, and freedom from arbitrary detention. Mary's lawyers and many sympathetic journalists asked a simple question. Where was her due process? She had not been convicted of a crime. She had not been given a fair trial. She was confined on the strength of laboratory evidence and administrative orders. For critics, that looked less like justice and more like bureaucratic overreach. Progressive era courts generally sided with public health officials. The landmark Supreme Court case Jacobson v. Massachusetts, 1905, upholding compulsory vaccination laws, set the tone. The court ruled that individual liberty could be curtailed for the common good when public safety was at stake. The decision emboldened local governments to act decisively in times of epidemic. By the time Mary Mallon challenged her detention in 1909, the legal winds were already against her. Judges accepted that the state had the right to isolate carriers, even if the carriers themselves were not ill. Still, Mary's case forced uncomfortable reflection. Quarantine had long been used against the visibly sick, yellow fever patients in southern ports, cholera victims in immigrant ships, but applying it to the healthy was new. Critics argued that it expanded state power into a realm where abuse was easy. Who decided who was a carrier? What safeguards existed against error or bias, and why, if dozens of other carriers were discovered in New York, was only Mary confined for life? These questions made her case resonate far beyond the island. For public health officials, the answer was both scientific and political. Scientifically, Mary was an unusually prolific shedder of typhoid bacilli. Politically, she was infamous. Her nickname made her a lightning rod. Releasing her risked not only further outbreaks, but also public outrage if her name appeared in connection with another death. In effect, her notoriety locked her in place. Other carriers could be managed quietly, but Mary had become the test case the city could not afford to lose. The progressive era faith in expertise meant that many reformers accepted this logic. Doctors were seen as trusted authorities, public health departments as guardians of modernity. Yet, the darker side of that faith was a willingness to sideline individual rights in the name of collective welfare. Immigrants, women and the poor often bore the brunt of those decisions with little power to resist. Mary Mallon, an Irish immigrant cook with a fiery personality, fit neatly into that category. Her story then was not just about one woman's stubborn denial. It was also about the growing pains of a society learning how to wield new scientific knowledge through law. The police power of the state could save lives, but it could also trample liberties. Mary's fate showed both the necessity and the danger of entrusting health officials with such sweeping authority. In the progressive era, the balance tipped towards safety. The courts blessed that choice. And Mary Mallon became the living proof of what it meant when law and liberty collided with public health. The legal precedents of the progressive era gave New York officials the authority to keep Mary Mallon confined, but they did not explain why she, in particular, bore the brunt of that authority while others slipped by. Dozens of typhoid carriers were identified in New York during the early 20th century. Some were released with conditions. Others were never even confined. Mary, by contrast, became a permanent resident of North Brother Island. That disparity raised questions not just about science, but about social standing. Class, gender, and immigrant identity played powerful roles in deciding who got blamed and who got locked away. Start with class. Most of the other identified carriers were not cooks in wealthy homes, but milkmen, labourers, or servants in tenements. Their anonymity worked in their favour. A milkman could be quietly reassigned, a labourer told to wash his hands and keep moving. Mary, however, had worked in the kitchens of upper-class families. When disease struck in Oyster Bay or Park Avenue, it embarrassed the social elite. These families had the clout to demand explanations, and investigators like George Soper took their complaints seriously. In effect, Mary's proximity to privilege made her more vulnerable. She was noticed, tracked, and written up in newspapers because her employers had the ear of the city and the press. Gender compounded the problem. Cooking was coded as women's work, and responsibility for household health often fell on female shoulders. A male milkman might pass on typhoid through his deliveries, but he was one of many faceless men in a supply chain. A female cook, by contrast, was seen as directly responsible for what went on the family table. When illness followed, blame naturally fell on the woman stirring the pot. Mary's defiance, her unwillingness to accept the diagnosis, her habit of arguing with doctors, even the story of her chasing Soper with a carving fork, made her an easy villain in a culture quick to condemn unruly women. Her case reinforced gendered expectations. Women were supposed to be compliant caregivers, not combative skeptics. Then there was the immigrant factor. Mary was an Irish immigrant in an era when Irish workers were still stereotyped as dirty, reckless, or resistant to authority. Though the Irish had gained political power in parts of New York, Irish women in domestic service remained at the bottom of the social hierarchy. Newspapers played into these prejudices, portraying Mary as stubborn, ignorant, and dangerous. Her accent, her temper, and her refusal to submit made her fit neatly into existing caricatures. It is telling that other carriers, often German or Scandinavian, were described in clinical terms, while Mary became Typhoid Mary, a nickname that turned her into a folk villain. Unequal enforcement also reflected the politics of publicity. Once the tabloids had latched onto Mary's story, health officials faced intense pressure. If they released her and another outbreak followed, the backlash would be fierce. No one wanted their name tied to the official who let Typhoid Mary loose. Meanwhile, lesser-known carriers could be handled quietly, without headlines. The double standard was less about microbiology than about optics. Mary's case became too public to treat privately. Mary herself understood this imbalance. In her letters, she complained that she was being singled out unfairly, that other carriers walked free while she remained caged. She pointed to the city's sanitation failures and the hypocrisy of making her the sole scapegoat for a disease spread by many hands. Her frustration was rooted not just in denial of the science, but in the reality of unequal treatment. She was not wrong. Her gender, class, and immigrant status made her a convenient example at a time when the city needed one. This unequal enforcement did not end with Mary. The progressive era often justified harsh public health measures through the language of science, but the enforcement was filtered through social hierarchies. Immigrant neighbourhoods bore the brunt of inspections, quarantines, and sanitation crackdowns. Women in domestic service shouldered blame for outbreaks in households that hired them. The poor were easier to confine than the wealthy. In this sense, Mary Mallon was both unique and typical. Unique in her fame, typical in how the weight of public health fell hardest on those with the least power to resist. Her permanent confinement, then, was not simply about typhoid bacilli. It was also about social anxieties, about women who talked back, immigrants who resisted authority, and servants who threatened the health of their employers. Science provided the justification, prejudice helped decide the sentence. And with Mary Mallon, those forces combined to produce a punishment no other carrier in New York ever faced. Life on an island, remembered not by her own name, but by one stamped on her by others. Mary Mallon's fate, permanent confinement on North Brother Island, was shaped by prejudice as much as by science. Yet the legal and medical machinery that surrounded her didn't vanish when she was gone. Instead, her case became a template cited by doctors, lawyers, and policymakers whenever new questions arose about how to handle invisible threats to public health. The phrase, Typhoid Mary, outlived the woman, turning into shorthand for anyone who spread disease without knowing it. Her story set precedents that continue to echo in public health debates today. The first precedent was the very idea of the healthy carrier. Before Mary, the concept was largely theoretical. After her, it became central to epidemiology. Medical schools began teaching carrier states as standard fare, and public health officials started actively hunting for other silent spreaders. Policies for monitoring, educating, and sometimes restricting carriers were shaped by the Mallon case. Even though she was treated more harshly than others, her story established that governments could intervene in the lives of people who looked healthy but posed a risk. That shift in thinking rippled outward, influencing how authorities responded to tuberculosis, polio, and later HIV. The second precedent involved quarantine law. Mary's failed habeas corpus petition in 1909 and her permanent detention in 1915 underscored the court's willingness to uphold broad state powers in the name of health. Judges leaned heavily on the logic of Jacobson v. Massachusetts 1905, which had validated compulsory smallpox vaccination. Together, these cases confirmed that individual liberty could be curtailed if the government demonstrated a significant threat to the community. That principle, controversial in Mary's time, still guides legal responses to outbreaks. During the COVID-19 pandemic, for example, courts cited the same early 20th century precedents when deciding whether mask mandates, lockdowns, or vaccine requirements were constitutional. A third precedent concerned communication, or in Mary's case, miscommunication. Her defiance showed the dangers of trying to impose science without winning trust. Officials ordered her to stop cooking, but never persuaded her that she was a carrier. They collected samples, but she suspected tampering. They offered gallbladder surgery, but to her it sounded like butchery. The breakdown of trust meant that Mary saw herself as a victim, not a partner in public health. Future health campaigns, from tuberculosis prevention to AIDS education, had to grapple with this lesson. Without buy-in, enforcement alone breeds resistance. The press's role also left a lasting mark. The nickname Typhoid Mary made her a permanent villain in the public imagination. That branding influenced not only her personal treatment, but also how health officials thought about the politics of contagion. When public fear crystallizes around a single name or face, it becomes easier to justify harsh measures and harder to apply policies evenly. Later outbreaks saw echoes of this pattern. Immigrants singled out during tuberculosis scares, gay men stigmatized during the early HIV/AIDS crisis, and Asian communities stereotyped during COVID-19. The unequal enforcement Mary endured became a cautionary tale, though not one the system always heeded. Another echo lies in the question of alternatives. After Mary, public health departments increasingly experimented with conditional release programs, monitoring systems, and hygiene training rather than immediate confinement. The recognition that lifelong quarantine was both politically risky and ethically fraught pushed authorities to consider less draconian solutions. Still, Mary's story lingered as a warning of what could happen when individuals broke those agreements. She became the stick behind the carrot: cooperate or risk becoming the next Typhoid Mary. Finally, her case shaped the broader debate about the balance between civil rights and community safety. Every time a city weighs whether to close schools during a flu outbreak or a court considers compulsory vaccination, Mary Mallon's ghost hovers in the background. She represents both the necessity of decisive action and the dangers of scapegoating. Policymakers invoke her name as evidence of why strict measures can be justified, but also as a reminder of the human cost when those measures fall unevenly. In the end, Mary Mallon's legacy is double-edged. She gave epidemiology one of its clearest early case studies of asymptomatic carriers and helped cement the authority of public health law. But she also exposed the vulnerabilities of that system, its reliance on unequal enforcement, its dependence on public trust, and its tendency to punish the powerless more harshly than the privileged. Those lessons continue to resonate. Whenever society confronts a new contagion, from influenza to Ebola to COVID-19, the questions Mary's life raised: who should be quarantined? For how long? By what authority? At what cost? Return to the forefront. By the time Mary Mallon was ferried back to North Brother Island for good, science had already gained a foothold in understanding carriers. But as the 20th century rolled on, microbiology peeled back layers of detail that explained why some people, like Mary, were such persistent spreaders. What her doctors in 1907 could only suspect, later researchers could demonstrate with microscopes, cultures, and eventually molecular biology. The picture that emerged was less about mystery and more about the stubborn biology of gallbladders, biofilms, and bacterial persistence. The gallbladder, a small pear-shaped organ tucked beneath the liver, became the focus of carrier studies. It stores bile, which helps digest fats, but in carriers it also serves as a reservoir for bacteria. In Mary's day, doctors hypothesized that her gallbladder was septic, a chronic infection site she refused to have removed. Later research confirmed this hunch. Typhoid bacilli could lodge in the gallbladder, especially if gallstones were present. The stones created tiny nooks and crannies where bacteria could cling, shielded from immune cells and antibiotics alike. Every time bile flowed into the intestines, it carried Salmonella with it, millions of tiny passengers leaving the gallbladder's safe harbour. What made this situation worse was the phenomenon of biofilms. Modern microbiology showed that bacteria can form slimy, protective layers on surfaces like gallstones. Inside a biofilm, Salmonella cells are less vulnerable to both the body's defences and drug treatments. Think of it as a microbial fortress, hard to penetrate, constantly replenished, and capable of shedding bacteria into the surrounding environment. In Mary's case, this meant she could remain outwardly healthy while her gallbladder quietly seeded her digestive tract with typhoid bacilli for decades. Persistence, the ability of bacteria to survive long-term without causing symptoms, became another key concept. Not every infected person becomes a carrier. Most clear the infection after the acute illness ends. But a minority, estimated at 2 to 5% of typhoid patients, harbour the bacteria for life. And they don't get sick because their immune systems keep the infection in check, but they don't get rid of it either. This explained why Mary never felt the fevers that racked her employers. Her immune system and the bacteria had reached a grim stalemate, one that allowed her to thrive while passing disease to others. These scientific advances also explain the uneven lab results that gave Mary ammunition for her denial. Carriers don't shed bacteria at the same rate every day. Some stool samples test positive, others come back negative. Intermittent shedding is now well documented, but in Mary's time, it seemed like inconsistency or even incompetence in the lab. To her, the negative tests confirmed her innocence. To later scientists, they confirmed the tricky biology of persistence. The gallbladder connection also reshaped treatment strategies. By the mid-20th century, surgery to remove the gallbladder, cholecystectomy, was a recognised option for carriers. In many cases, the procedure successfully ended the shedding of Salmonella. But the surgery was far riskier in Mary's time, with high infection and mortality rates. Her refusal in the 1900s, understandable given the dangers, looked in hindsight like the fork in the road that sealed her fate. Had she lived decades later, a relatively safe operation might have freed her from both her bacteria and her island. Microbiology's progress also reframed the ethics of her case. By the 1930s and 40s, doctors understood that carriers were a predictable biological phenomenon, not moral deviants or reckless workers. Public health began to focus more on identifying carriers systematically and managing them with education, surgery, or antibiotics once they became available. Mary, unfortunately, lived at the awkward cusp between ignorance and understanding. She became infamous not because she was unique, but because she was discovered early, resisted fiercely, and carried a name the press refused to forget. Science, in other words, eventually caught up with Mary Mallon. It confirmed that her gallbladder likely hosted dense bacterial colonies clinging to gallstones in protective biofilms. It explained her intermittent test results, her persistent carrier state, and the tragedy of her denial. What it could not do was undo the decades she spent on North Brother Island, or erase the stigma of a nickname that turned a complex biological condition into a one-woman morality play. As microbiology clarified the role of the gallbladder in chronic typhoid carriage, one question hovered over Mary Mallon's case. Could surgery have freed her from both her bacteria and her island? The option of cholecystectomy, the removal of the gallbladder, was floated more than once during her years under medical supervision. To modern eyes, it seems like a straightforward solution, but in Mary's time the operation was far from routine, carrying risks that made her refusal understandable, even if history judged it as the choice that sealed her fate. Gallbladder surgery in the early 1900s was still a relatively new procedure. The first successful cholecystectomy had been performed in Germany in 1882, and by the turn of the century, the operation was being attempted in major hospitals. But the field of abdominal surgery was young and perilous. Antisepsis and anaesthesia were improving, but infection, hemorrhage and shock were constant threats. Mortality rates for gallbladder removal hovered around 10 to 15% in the early 20th century, figures that made the prospect daunting, especially for a woman who did not believe she was ill in the first place. Doctors at Riverside Hospital suggested the surgery because they suspected, correctly as later science showed, that Mary's gallbladder harboured the typhoid bacilli. Removing it might have eliminated her carrier state and restored her freedom. But persuasion was difficult. From Mary's perspective, the proposal sounded absurd. She had never felt a twinge of gallbladder pain, never experienced the fevers that supposedly raged inside her body, and now doctors wanted to cut her open to fix a problem she did not believe existed. She saw the suggestion not as a medical solution, but as a violation, an experiment at her expense. The mistrust between Mary and her doctors made matters worse. By the time surgery was proposed, she had already spent years battling the health department, contesting their authority and denouncing their tests as flawed. Why should she trust their surgeons with her life? Consent in such an environment was unlikely. To Mary, the operation looked less like a path to freedom than another indignity forced on her by officials who seemed determined to treat her as something less than human. Within the medical community, the debate was lively. Some physicians believed surgery was the only humane option, better to risk an operation than condemn a woman to lifelong isolation. Others warned that the risks outweighed the potential benefits. Even if the gallbladder was removed, what if the bacteria had spread to other tissues? What if she died on the table? The ethics of operating on someone who denied her condition also complicated the matter. Surgery without genuine consent was unthinkable, but genuine consent was impossible without Mary's belief in the diagnosis. As decades passed, the balance of risk shifted. By the 1930s and 1940s, gallbladder surgery had become safer, and antibiotics like chloramphenicol offered additional treatment options. In that later context, Mary's carrier state might have been cured or at least managed without permanent confinement. But she lived in the wrong era. In 1907 or 1915, the knife was a gamble with long odds, and Mary was unwilling to stake her life on a theory she rejected outright. The tragedy is that surgery might indeed have worked. Later studies showed that most chronic carriers housed their bacteria in the gallbladder, and many were cured after cholecystectomy. Had Mary accepted the procedure, or had it been safer and more convincing in her time, her story might have been very different. She could have resumed her life, her reputation perhaps salvaged, her name not etched into history as Typhoid Mary. Instead, her refusal, shaped by fear, mistrust and the genuine dangers of early surgery, left her in limbo. In hindsight, the debate over cholecystectomy underscores how medicine evolves. What seemed reckless in 1910 became routine a few decades later. What Mary dismissed as mutilation, later patients embraced as cure. But history is made in its own moment, not with the benefit of hindsight. For Mary Mallon, the scalpel remained a bridge she would not cross, and so her path narrowed to the island she never left again. Mary Mallon's refusal of surgery left her trapped on North Brother Island, but her story was only one piece of a much larger battle against typhoid. While the tabloids obsessed over Typhoid Mary as a villainous cook, the real victory over the disease came not from scapegoating individuals, but from building systems. Over the first decades of the 20th century, public health shifted from chasing down suspects in kitchens to transforming the very infrastructure of cities: water treatment, sewage disposal and food safety. These fixes, though less sensational than a rogue carrier, ultimately did what no quarantine could. They drove typhoid rates down across the board. Water was the first front. Typhoid is a waterborne disease, and in the 19th century, contaminated wells and city water supplies were its main highway. By Mary's time, New York and other cities had begun experimenting with filtration and chlorination. The science was simple but revolutionary. Sand filters could remove bacteria from drinking water, and chlorine applied in carefully measured doses could kill what filtration missed. The results were dramatic. Cities that adopted these systems saw typhoid deaths plummet within a few years. What Mary's doctors struggled to enforce, one household at a time, hygiene and prevention, was being accomplished on a mass scale through pipes, tanks and treatment plants. Food safety followed a similar trajectory. Milk, long a notorious carrier of disease, became a focus for reformers. Pure milk campaigns pushed for pasteurization, a process that heated milk to kill pathogens. At first controversial, critics claimed it altered the taste or gave dairies an excuse to be sloppy. Pasteurization eventually became standard. With it, the risk of typhoid from the morning glass of milk or the cream in a dessert diminished sharply. Other measures targeted the food workforce. While Mary Mallon became the famous example, many cities quietly required medical exams or health certificates for food handlers, embedding disease prevention into the daily operations of restaurants, cafeterias and markets. Sewage systems also transformed the landscape. In the late 19th century, waste often seeped into rivers and wells, feeding the cycle of infection. Progressive-era engineering projects built modern sewer networks, separating waste from drinking water. It was expensive, unglamorous work digging tunnels, laying pipes, building pumping stations, but it did more to curb typhoid than any single prosecution of a carrier. Where sewers were modernised, outbreaks dwindled. Where they lagged, fevers persisted. Together, these infrastructure fixes reframed typhoid as less a matter of personal blame and more a matter of public systems. Mary Mallon's story, with its drama of chases and quarantines, stuck in the imagination. But the true decline of typhoid was written not in newspaper cartoons, but in engineering reports and municipal budgets. By the 1920s and 1930s, cases in American cities had dropped so low that the fear once attached to the disease began to fade. Typhoid was not eliminated. Sporadic outbreaks still occurred, but the era of mass urban epidemics was ending. This shift also changed the ethics of public health. With better systems in place, officials relied less on isolating individuals. Carriers were still monitored, but they were managed within a safer environment, one where water, milk, and sewage were no longer efficient amplifiers of contagion. The Typhoid Mary approach, singling out one person as the vector of danger, gave way to systemic prevention, which not only worked better, but spread responsibility more fairly. The irony is striking. While Mary spent decades confined as an example of what not to do, the real answer to typhoid lay not in punishing cooks, but in building infrastructure that protected everyone. Her case remained a touchstone in medical schools and courtrooms, but the disease she symbolised was undone by filters, chlorine, pasteurisation and sewers. The stigma attached to her name lingered, but the systems around her made her story increasingly exceptional rather than typical. By the time Mary died in 1938, the world she had entered as a young cook had been transformed. The New York that once chased her through kitchens and alleys now relied on treatment plants and health codes. Typhoid, once a constant spectre, was well on its way to being controlled. Her story endured as cautionary legend, but the real lesson came from the infrastructure that turned contagion from inevitability into rarity. Mary Mallon's life unfolded at the crossroads of science, law and society, in an era when modern public health was still taking shape. To her, She was simply a hard-working cook, unfairly persecuted and scapegoated for the city's wider sanitation failures. To health officials, she was living proof that invisible carriers could spread deadly disease, and therefore a threat too great to ignore. To the press, she became Typhoid Mary, a symbol more than a person, stamped with a nickname she never escaped. Her decades of confinement on North Brother Island remain controversial, not only for their harshness, but for what they revealed about power. She was treated more severely than other carriers, in part because of her immigrant status, her gender, her defiance, and the publicity surrounding her case. In that sense, Mary's story is not just about microbes, but about inequality, how class and prejudice shaped the enforcement of science. Yet her case also helped usher in a turning point. She forced doctors to reckon with the biology of asymptomatic carriers, lawyers to grapple with the limits of civil liberties in epidemics, and policymakers to consider how systems, not scapegoats, would ultimately stop disease. While she lived out her life in quarantine, the real battle against typhoid was won in water treatment plants, milk pasteurization campaigns, and modern sewer systems that protected entire populations. Mary Mallon died in 1938, still in captivity, but her story continues to echo in every debate about quarantine, vaccination, and public trust. She remains a reminder that science alone cannot solve the challenges of contagion. Policy, communication, and fairness matter just as much. Her legacy is both cautionary and instructive, a warning about the human cost of stigma and unequal enforcement, and a testament to how infrastructure and collective responsibility ultimately triumph where punishment fails. Good night.